Hello, my name is Chris O'Donnell and I'm a Blue Badge guide here in London, which means I'm licensed to do walking tours all over the capital. That could be the West End, East End, Tower of London, Westminster Abbey, and today it's the City of London. Here we are, St Mary Axe, better known as the Gherkin, right in the heart of the financial centre of the UK, better known as the Square Mile. Now today we're going to look at the city's history, which is glorious in a lot of respects. It's historic, it goes back 2,000 years. But there's also a dark side to that success. A lot of the city's success was built on the Transatlantic Slave Trade. So today's walk is to get to understand what that transatlantic slave trade was, and look at the physical reminders, the squares, the corporate headquarters, sculpture, even the pubs. They all tell us a story, and that's my job as a guide, is to weave you through all the physical memories and stories that tell you of the slave trade through actual physically walking past them. Now, one of the things we're going to learn about today is the city recovering from tragedy. We'll hear briefly about the Great Fire of London, which in 1666 destroyed 80% of the city. And even recently, 1992, the Gherkin came out of a bomb explosion in 1992, where tragically 3 people and 14-year-old Danielle lost their lives. And those 3 are memorialised here in these 3 columns on the edge of the wall, just outside the Gherkin. More poignantly, when excavations began for the Gherkin, there was another 14-year-old girl discovered. But she came from another age, from another city, from Londinium. And that's where we're going to go to our first stop. So whenever I'm walking here in St Mary Axe, I always think about young 14-year-old Danielle, so tragically killed. And I also think about this young girl from Roman London, 350 AD, and she was also about 14. We don't know much about her, only the fact that she's laid out north to south, a few grave goods, and her arms are crossed across her chest. Who was she? Was she daughter of a merchant, a courtier, or was she a slave? And is that relevant to our story? And the answer is no. Because even in the ruthless Roman Empire, slaves were still classed as people. And as we'll find out later, that's not necessarily the case with the transatlantic slave trade. What we do know about the young girl is she would have been told great stories about emperors. One in particular I want to talk about, which is relevant to our story. Severus Septimus, who came to Britain. He came to Britain with a glamorous court, with a glamorous wife. We know this from papers that were found in York. They were the David and Victoria Beckham of their day, brought exotic fashions to the country. He helped build Hadrian's Wall, and he helped build the Great Wall that surrounded London. And he also died here in Britain, so he is relevant to us. But what's most relevant from our story is because Septimus Severus, Emperor of Rome and Britannia, was from Africa. And as we'll find out today, there's not ever a chance that any black African, slave or otherwise, could ever be Prime Minister or King or even the Lord Mayor of the City of London across the period between the 15th and 19th and 20th century transatlantic slave trade story. In fact, Septimus would be horrified, even despite the ruthlessness of the Roman Empire, with the story of the beginnings of the slave trade that we're going to find out at our next stop. Right, hello, here we are on the corner of Leadenhall Street. I've just walked down from the building on the corner there, which in 1660 was the headquarters of the Royal African Company. 1660, the year of the Restoration. Charles II had been put back on the throne and he didn't have any money. But he had a city of London teeming with merchants who'd heard about new opportunities, new trading opportunities with colonies and countries across the world. So Charles set up a number of what you might call geographical monopolies. The Hudson Bay Company traded pelts, which is what is now the eastern seaboard of America. The Muscovy Company traded timber, with what is now modern-day Russia. And the Royal African Company, led by his brother, the Duke of York, who became James II, the Royal African Company traded in people. The Royal African Company led what's the first leg of the Triangle of Terror. The triangle being Western Europe, Western Africa, and the Americas. And over the next 2 stops, we're going to go through what that triangle was. The first leg was the Royal African Company putting ships together, sailing out of the city of London, out of Liverpool, out of Bristol, out of Glasgow, taking goods to West Africa to trade them for people. Capturing people, imprisoning them in castles, and putting them on manacles on slave ships was a violent process. And the Duke of York didn't hold back in his violence. To ensure that he personally got his investment realised when these people were shipped to America and then sold at auction, he had them branded DOY, Duke of York. And that violence was endemic in the trade for the next 200-300 years. And over the next few stops, we'll understand why. The Royal African Company shipped more slaves than any other private company at all. Over 150,000 directly by this company went across. Where did they go? They went to the Caribbean, and that's where we're going next. So here we are in Fen Court, and Fen Court is one of the ancient churchyards of the City of London. St Gabriel Fen Church was a parish church here and burned down in the Great Fire in 1666. It was never rebuilt, but it's here as a little pocket garden to enjoy. And it's here that there's been a beautiful sculpture that was unveiled in 2008 by Desmond Tutu, the great anti-apartheid campaigner. And it's by Michael Visocci, who's the sculptor, and Lem Sisse, who's the poet. And it does 2 things. One, it tells a story of the second and third legs of that triangle of terror. And also it prompts us as people, citizens of London, to ask ourselves questions about the history that we've benefited from. The sculpture, as you see, echoes the church's history. So here's a pulpit, and there seems to be a congregation, but the congregation is made up of, or represented by, pieces of sugarcane. And this is the second leg of the Triangle of Terror. The Royal African Company started shifting hundreds of thousands of people to the Caribbean, and as we'll see later, that became millions. In fact, the European nations shipped over 12 million people from West Africa to the Americas and to work on slave colonies. Britain, 3.5 million. And almost all the British people, or enslaved people, came to work in the Caribbean and worked on sugar plantations. Sugar was incredibly profitable and in incredibly high demand. Backbreaking work, 12, perhaps 15 hours a day, and the life expectancy of a slave might be as short as 5 or even 7 years. High profitability of a product like sugar, rising demand in Europe and the rest of the world meant there was rising demand tragically, for enslaved people from Africa. So that triangle, goods, finished goods coming back to London in the form of sugar, being sold and traded for other goods at incredibly profitable levels, shipped to Africa, more people being shipped back to the Caribbean, and the whole terrible process starts again. In that kind of cycle of violence, of course, there was resistance. There was resistance on ships, and perhaps 10% of those enslaved people never made it to the Caribbean because they rose and perhaps were killed or thrown off the ship in terrible conditions. There was also violence and resistance in the colonies. And that meant that as merchants who were investing in plantations and in slave ships, etc., there was high risk. There was high risk that their investments were going to be lost. So any merchant in any business that has high risk looks for insurance. And that is where we're going for our next stop. But before we do so, let's understand what this sculpture, which is the cooperation between Michael Visocci and Lem Sisse, the poet, is telling us. It cleverly echoes the history of the parish church, but what Lem Sisse does is interweaves the language of the city with the language of the Bible, and therefore asks questions of us. So here, cash flow runs deep, but spirit deeper. You ask, am I my brother's keeper? My brother's keeper. This is from the Bible, and it's interspersing that with city language. So in other words, us as citizens of London, perhaps employees of London, is asking us questions. In fact, the title of the whole piece, Guilt of Cain, echoing the Bible story where Cain kills his brother Abel and he's racked by guilt. Guilt in this instance, in terms of the sculpture's name, is G-I-L-T, which of course is a British bond issued in the City of London to raise money for the government. This is echoing the second and third legs of that terror of triangle. How was this system maintained? How was it insured? We'll find out at our next stop. So here we are in Lime Street outside Lloyd's, but before I talk about this insurance company, I just want you to look just straight down there, one of my favourite sights in the City of London. You've got the Gherkin, of course, but just nestled at the bottom, can you see that old church with a square steeple? That's one of the very few buildings to survive the Great Fire of London in 1666 and also the Blitz. In fact, only 19 buildings survived the Great Fire. 30,000 were destroyed, 100,000 made for homeless. And what I always think actually is when we come back here in 100 years for a redo of this film, everything around here, including the Gherkin, will be gone, but that church will still be there. So next time you're in Lime Street, check it out. Let's go and see Lloyd's. So we're outside the wonderful Lloyd's building built by, or designed by Richard Rogers and known to many here in Lime Street in the middle of the City of London. Now, in the summer of 2020, Lloyd's, the biggest insurance marketplace in the world, issued an apology, a heartfelt apology, it has to be said, about their role in the slave trade. And it wasn't just an apology, it was a commitment to commit resource, people, to delve into records and to find out just how deeply Lloyd's themselves were involved and potentially to pay back reparations, etc. That debate goes on. So all the theme about renewal, the City of London renews, and corporations like Lloyd's are looking at their historic role and moving to try and make things right in one kind of sense. Why the apology? Well, we heard at the last stop about the growth of the slave trade and the fact that merchants were investing in what became a high-risk commodity, sugar. Why was it high risk? It's because the people who were being forced to harvest it were occasionally burning it, occasionally resisting, quite understandably. And what happened in 1686 is that Edward Lloyd had opened up a coffee shop on the banks of the Thames, and we're going to be going past it just later. That coffee shop became the centre for marine insurance, and his timing could not have been better, because in 1688 the old Stuart monarchy we've heard about, Charles and James, went, and in came William of Orange in what became known as the Glorious Revolution. William Pettigrew, in his book Freedom's Debt, talks about this as being a pivotal point in the slave trade, because what we start to hear now is the language that we used to hear from City of London merchants. This is about the era of free trade, away from the tyranny of the monarchy. But as William Pettigrew points out, what all that meant is that the Royal African Company's monopoly on the trading of people was at an end. This was Big Bang. This was deregulation of the slave trade. And the 150,000 slaves that the Royal African Company had done in its entirety, in its history, became, in the 18th century, 150,000 slaves a year. You can see from this chart that William Pettigrew produced just how dramatic that increase is. So almost immediately from 1688, the royal family's out of the way, the royal monopolies are over, and the City of London and its merchants move into slavery in a huge way. And Lloyd's of London at one point was underwriting 40% of that trade. What that meant with merchants with cover for risk meant they were more likely to invest. And these high profit companies and products were also being insured by Lloyd's. Coffee, tobacco, sugar, highly addictive, highly profitable, coming into the City of London. And Lloyd's today owed its preeminence to a large extent to its involvement in the slave trade then. We're now going to move to where that explosion in merchant, in trading happened, which is in the coffee houses of Cornhill. Well, here we are in St Michael's Alley, outside the Jamaica Wine House, known affectionately to city traders as the Jam Pot. What a fine pub it is. It's got a fine history, but it's also got a dark story behind it, and I'm going to come on to that in a moment. But first, I want to talk about coffee and coffee houses. And here, Pasca Rose is commemorated as bringing in and building London's first ever coffee house in 1652. And why is that relevant to our story? Well, it's because before 1652, way back in centuries before, most Londoners were either a little bit or a lot drunk. And the reason for that is you just couldn't trust the water supply. But they understood that if you brewed beer, or to some certain extent drink gin, that you wouldn't necessarily die. You might die of other things if you did it to excess, but you wouldn't be dying of something like cholera, which they associated with bad water. And along comes coffee. And suddenly people realise that you can discuss business and politics and everything under the sun without getting into a fight. So coffee houses exploded as a concept right across Cornhill. And with that came information, with that came the first newspapers, information, newspapers, intelligence. The Royal Exchange is just across the road. The Stock Exchange comes to light. And England, London, the city of London becomes the centre of European commerce, all on the back of the coffee houses. They're not like the Starbucks that we know today, where you go in and people are on laptops and very quiet. These were hubbubs of activity. Good morning, sir, what news from Tripoli? And that news from Tripoli could affect stocks in North Africa. All that intelligence, this was this information superhighway of the 18th century. Edward Lloyd, we heard about launching his coffee house, but other coffee houses like Garraway's were in auction. Other coffee houses specialised in different commodities. And the Jamaica Coffee House was at the centre of the Jamaica trade. We've heard about sugar, and this is quite often where intelligence about sugar was gathered before going to make your trades in the Royal Exchange, borrow from the Bank of England, all in one geographical area. It made sense for the City of London now to be able to globally expand. But there's another product, and I use the word advisor, that's coming from Jamaica that we've already heard about, and that is enslaved people. And the Jamaica Coffee House, as then was, before it was a wine house, was the centre of the slave trade. We talk about a slave trade and numbers of people that have gone to the Caribbean and led brutal and violent lives and terrible deaths. But sometimes things bring things to life. And I've got something here that's as simple as a newspaper advertisement. And these newspaper advertisements were for slaves. Slaves that, with any given opportunity, would go on the run. And those advertisements were placed in national and London newspapers and also posted inside here in the Jamaica Coffee House. I'm going to read you some now, and I warn you, some of them are quite shocking. Run away, the 17th of June, last from his master. A short Negro man, 18 years old, named Jack. Blubber-lipped, sharp-shinned, long-heeled, speaks a good English, with a frieze coat and breeches, hath been seen at Saffron Hill near Holborn. He is marked on one shoulder with WB and on the other with WD. Whoever brings him to the Jamaica Coffee House in Miles Alley in Cornhill shall have a guinea reward. So what's remarkable about that is clearly this man does not see this boy as human. He sees him as property, as cargo. To the extent he's been branded, presumably by one or two owners. And this kind of very stark description of clearly not someone who's my man and my brother started to affect part of the population, particularly those of a very religious persuasion. So the printed word is now becoming important in our story, because for the first time, information's been exchanged about the slave trade, but it's also been read and therefore understood by sections of the population who start to get concerned about it, and we start to move towards people wanting a road to abolition. And the first people to really become involved in this and to take benefit from the printed word, which was giving information about the brutality of this trade, were Quakers, and then other what we call non-conformist religions. In 1662, there'd been an Act of Uniformity passed by Charles II. We already heard about him and the Royal African Company. And it meant that if you didn't conform, if you weren't a member of the Church of England, you were Christian but not Church of England, you were non-conformist. You couldn't go to university, you couldn't join the legal profession, you couldn't become an MP. But these were people of principle, and they became important on the road to abolition, and we're going to hear about them at our next stop. Well, here we are in George Yard, quite an unassuming part of the City of London. But in terms of our story regarding abolition of the slave trade and ultimately slavery itself, this is one of the most important places. And the reason for that is this is the place in 1787 where 12 people came together to form the Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade. And it included some really important members. Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, William Wilberforce, who we're going to meet about later, but also a potter by the name of Josiah Wedgwood. And he and others understood that the importance in terms of swinging opinion was of course about the printed word that they were seeing now in the gazettes and posted in the taverns, etc., about the cruelty of slavery, but also that they needed visual clues. And here is the stamp for the Society for Effecting the Abolition of this Trade, which was designed by Josiah Wedgwood. And it became, arguably, the world's first political icon. Ladies made badges out of pottery naturally, and wore them on their lapels. Women now became involved in this debate. So it began the abolition of the slave trade with outsiders. If you were nonconformist or if you were a woman, you couldn't join the judiciary, you couldn't go to university, you couldn't become an MP, but you could become influential. As these nonconformists like Wedgwood became successful in business, they gained money, and with money comes influence, and with influence comes a platform. The printing press that stood here, this is the reason they met here, was owned by one James Phillips. He too understood the importance of the power of a visual image, and he printed what became one of the world's most famous icons in terms of abolition of slavery. And here it is. It's the Brooks drawing. Devastatingly, what Phillips realised all he needed to do to expose the cruelty, the vicious aggression of the slave trade was just to publish some diagrams that the slave trade itself prints. Here, this diagram is of the slave ship Brooks, which sailed 11 times out of Liverpool down to West Africa, taking enslaved people across the Atlantic towards the Caribbean. And these dark lines are people. What's horrific about it is how dehumanizing it is. They don't look like people at all. All the detail is really in the structure of the ship, which shows that this society or the slavery system wasn't seeing the enslaved people as people at all, but as purely as commodities. What they also realised now, these abolitionists, there were 12 in number, 9 were nonconformists, but 3 brought in were Church of England. Important people because he needed people on the inside on the establishment to take on the establishment. But first, before they needed to move bills in Parliament for the abolition of slavery, they needed to move against some of these big institutions, which included the Bank of England and the Law Courts of England. And that's where we're going to in our next stops. Well, we met Edward Lloyd earlier, setting up his coffee house, and here's the very site of it on what is now a Sainsbury's. Look at the dates. We talked about 1688, the Glorious Revolution. It's about to launch a mercantile revolution here in Cornhill. 1691, Edward Lloyd sets up his coffee house. Why here? Just follow me down here, down Lombard Street. Information is power. This is the 17th, the 18th century information superhighway. And right at the centre is Post Office Court. And it can be that important that as information comes into the post office, feeds the business intelligence and the marine intelligence specifically that was going on in Edward Lloyd's coffee house. So commerciality is now right at the centre of London, and it's interwoven into pretty well all sectors of the society. It's quite difficult now to unravel who's a slave and who's not a slave, because we all are. And just to reinforce how important, how enwebbed the establishment was in the slave trade itself, let's go and see the Bank of England and Mansion House. So here we are, Bank Junction, in front of the Bank of England. And sometimes it's only when you see the actual scale of the building that you appreciate the kind of power that the Bank of England has and did when it was founded in 1694. And this power was what the abolitionists were up against. In order to change the law They had to change the establishment mindset. And imagine the scale of that challenge. Here, the Bank of England, 10 of the governors, no less, were slave owners over a period of time. And the political power, the Lord Mayor of London, it's not just ceremonial, but was really important politically, 15 of the mayors between 1660 and 1690 were also slavers. So you had political and financial establishment difficult to change. The only way now, in order to get legislation to abolish slavery through, was to challenge it in the courts. And that's where we're going to go next. Well, here we are in Guildhall, the old building. It's been the centre of civic and ceremonial government of the City of London for over 900 years. But I brought you here, not just because it's a beautiful building, but because in the 18th century, it's also where the King's Bench sat. And this was a court that heard important commercial cases. And there was one particular case that really added fire to the abolitionist cause. We talked about the people, the abolitionists. We met Thomas Clarkson and a number of others in George Yard. But the abolitionist movement was also enhanced by a number of other people in other communities. Abolitionists weren't just right-thinking white men. They were also right-thinking black men. There was a community in 18th century London between 6,000 and 10,000 black people. There are the people who were escaped slaves. Some of those boys and girls in the Jamaica wine house that we met, the Jamaica coffee house we heard about, they made it. Some people were freed by benevolent people such as Samuel Johnson, the lexicographer. Famously, he freed Francis Barbara, who was his servant, as it were, who became a free man, married a draper, and lived in London for a long time. And also people like Olaudah Equiano, who was a freed slave, who bought his freedom, wrote a book in London and published it, and ceaselessly lobbied newspapers, etc., about the horrors of the slave trade. He formed with his friend Ottobah Cugoano the Sons of Africa, and they formed a powerful lobby, giving first-hand accounts of the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. It was Olaudah Equiano who brought Thomas Clarkson here in 1783 because one of the most infamous cases, should I say, was held here in Guildhall. And it surrounded what became known as the Zong Massacre. The Zong was a British slave ship and it was sailing to the Caribbean and there was sickness on board. The captain threw off 132 people off the ship and a further 10 voluntarily stepped off it to certain death because of the horror that they'd seen and witnessed. Incredibly to the modern mind, when the ship docked in Jamaica, the ship's captain immediately sued the insurance company and asked for compensation. The insurance company refused and the case was heard here in Guildhall. Olaudah Equiano had heard about this, alerted Thomas Clarkson, who came every day and wrote a transcript of the case, so it's thanks to him that we know exactly what happened. Long story short, the slave ship owner didn't win his compensation, but he didn't win the compensation not because he was convicted of murder or the people who threw off, not at all, because these people, the enslaved people who were thrown off, weren't seen even in law as people. The reason they lost the case was just because the judge deemed he hadn't taken on enough water, and even then that was contested. But because he hadn't taken on enough water, he couldn't put it down to the Act of Sea, therefore he couldn't claim compensation. But that just shows the level institutionalised violence and institutionalised racism that was in the system. Even in the legal system, they were not being recognised as people, but still as cargo being shipped from one country across to another. So we talked about the black abolitionists, and we talked about the Sons of Africa, the Society for the Effects of Abolition of the Slave Trade, largely populated by non-conformist people, and the Brooks drawings and these huge iconographic campaigns were being launched in favour of abolition. But the challenge was all these, or the majority of these people, were outside the system, outside the establishment. We needed someone, or the cause needed someone in Parliament, in the heart of the establishment. And on our next stop, we're going to meet that person. Here we are at the top of St Swithin's Lane in front of the magnificent church, St Mary Woolnoth, designed by Nicholas Hawksmoor. He was a protege of Christopher Wren, who built St Paul's Cathedral amongst many others. You might know Hawksmoor Church in Spitalfields, Christchurch, the big white huge structure that dominates that market there. But we're not here to talk about Nicholas Hawksmoor. We're here to talk about one famous rector called John Newton, who was here in the 18th century. He was born in Wapping, was John, pressed into the Navy. What does that mean? Well, it meant he was clocked on the head once and taken onto a ship and forced to work it. And he spent his early life on ships, slave ships. He'd moved to Liverpool in the 1740s and for years worked the slave ships across the Atlantic and down to Africa. And then one night, terrible storm just off Ireland. John Newton thought he was going to die, and for the first time he praised and prayed to God. His life was saved, and he then underwent some kind of conversion where he devoted his life then to Christianity, and he became a priest. When as a priest, he used to support his fearsome and fierce sermons with writing hymns. And one famous one echoes his life, really, where he regrets his past sins and gives thanks to the God that saved a wretch like him. Saved a wretch like him. Yes, John Newton wrote Amazing Grace. It was published in America, actually, and caught on there in terms of its fame. And when Ella Fitzgerald and Elvis Presley sang it around 1970, it became almost a global hymn for the civil rights movement, which is appropriate for today, or talk around slavery, that were able to come to the magnificent church and where John Newton became a rector. And he became a rector with a reputation for fantastic sermons, and particularly about the abolition of slavery. Drawing on his past experience in the slave trade, he deeply regretted it, continually asked God for forgiveness, but more importantly, campaigned for its abolition. And one day, a particularly important MP turned up, William Wilberforce, who was so moved by the power and passion of Newton's sermons, he asked him to become a member of his congregation, to become a priest himself. But Newton was aware that William Wilberforce, Church of England, politician, charismatic, was someone the abolitionist movement needed on the inside, someone in Westminster who could help shape legislation, convince other MPs to actually pass legislation to end the slave trade. And in 1807, that act was passed. John Newton died, perhaps thinking his later life's work was done, was completed. Was that true? Unfortunately not. The slave trade was abolished, so it's illegal now to take African people from the west of Africa across the Atlantic to the Caribbean, but the slave trade, the slavery itself continued. The plantations, the horror, the terror. In 1823, in the colony of Demerara, when you think about sugar, next time you're baking a cake, think about these people. 1823, rose up in a kind of non-violent rebellion, burning crops, but asking really to be considered as humans, because they'd heard in 1807 the slave trade was abolished. That uprising was brutally suppressed. 1831, 1832, there was a huge revolt by what would now be called freedom fighters. These 60,000 of the 300,000 slaves that were in Jamaica rose in a fierce revolt to fight for their freedom. They believed in 1807 that was a precursor to their freedom, and it was now 1831, and their lives hadn't changed. It was a suppression of the revolt and the violence that supported it. Reports coming back to England, to Britain at the time, angered, shocked and hurt too many people in the establishment. They realised now that the game was up, that slavery itself had to be abolished. But the challenge, of course, was financial. As we've seen, the slave trade was in every part of the British economy. So the problem was money, the problem was financial. And sometimes when the problem is financial, sometimes the problem is money, sometimes the solution is yet more money. And we're going to our next stop to understand how finance, supported by the City of London, finally abolished slavery. here we are on Poultry at the back of Rothschild's London HQ, which is the tall square glass building that towers over this particular part of the City of London. And Nathan Rothschild, back in 1834, had an important role in the ending of slavery. Remember, there had been big uprisings in 1823 and 1831 in the Caribbean, and the establishment now wanted to end it. But how to end it? The economy is so wrapped up in the slave trade. There were dockers out. London was the biggest dock in the world, employing tens of thousands of people. Rothschild, who was an abolitionist, have recently issued an apology for their involvement in the slave trade, because plantation owners were sometimes using their plantation, their land in the Caribbean, as collateral for loans, which are then invested in different projects in the City of London. So try and unscramble all this was really difficult. So as we said earlier, if the solution or the problem is money, quite often the solution is more money. And that's exactly what the British government did. Effectively, they bought out 800,000 slaves across the Caribbean from the owners in one big, huge mortgage deal. That cost the government £20 million. In 1834 money, that's about 17–20 billion pounds today. Or more helpfully, it represented 40% of the British GDP, one payment. Just to be clear, who was being compensated here? Not any of the enslaved people at all. They didn't receive a dollar, a pound. All the money went to the 40,000 people who had a small or a very large investment in plantations in the Caribbean. To give you an idea of the scale of the borrowing, 40% of the GDP, needing Nathan Rothschild to raise 15 million of that and get the government to issue a bond. So what happens when governments issue a bond to raise money, they then pay it off over time. So effectively Rothschilds were buying out the slave trade that the city had helped create and giving itself an income over decades and almost a century, because the bonds that the government issued to pay out the £20 million, 40% of the GDP, to the slave owners in the Caribbean only expired in 2015. So if you're watching this and you paid tax to the British government before 2015, you have helped contribute to compensation to those slave owners. And you can imagine how difficult this was in 1834 for all the people left there. Some slave owners left, the plantations, some continued as they were before. But it's that legacy, the difficulty of reconstructing countries out of the devastation of hundreds of years of the slave trade that led to some of the problems that we witness today. And to hear and to think about those issues, we're going to move now to our final stop at the Royal Exchange. Well, here we are at Bank Junction, the last stop on our tour. And we're in front of the Royal Exchange. And I'm going to walk you through the Royal Exchange, through the architectural details that's telling a story. If you ever look at pediments, that's a huge triangular piece on top of the columns. Quite often that tells you something about the building itself or the people who built it. In this instance, it's both. So I'm going to walk you through the pediment now. What I want you to do now is to look up at the top of the Royal Exchange, the triangular structure that sits on top of the columns. This is what we call the pediment. In the very centre, you can see a woman, and in her left hand is a charter of exchange, and in her right, it's resting on a rudder. She's steering Britain, who is at the centre of the world, through the oceans of commerce. And she stands on a quotation from the Bible, picked by Prince Albert, who was consort to Queen Victoria. So this is not only the City of London at the centre of the world, but also under the Word of God. Look to her right and to your left. Two figures here represents the Lord Mayor of London, Alderman and a Sheriff. Behind them are two other figures, one a Muslim, one a Hindu, and behind those in the corner kneeling is a Turk and an Armenian discussing bookkeeping, accounting. Look back at commerce now, look at her left hand, she's holding that chart of exchange, and then you've got two British merchants to her left and to your right, and they're inspecting some material being showed by a Persian. And just to the right of those is a Chinese man, and in front of him is an African who's on his knees. And that is the only representation of a black man in the City of London. And that's a pointer to the future, because this is 10 years, maybe 20 by the time it was built, after the abolition of slavery, but still black people are being stereotyped like that. And that's the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. And it's actually the devastating legacy, because it wasn't racism that caused slavery. It's actually the other way around. Slavery called racism, which is still with us today. And we've learned some key dates today. 1660, Charles II, the Royal African Company, the beginning of the institutionalised slave trade. 1688, deregulation, the Big Bang, all those merchant companies in Cornhill exploding, and the city growing as a big institution. 1807, finally, the abolitionists get their way, the slave trade is abolished, and 1834, the big payout, and that's the end of slavery itself. But another day, May 2020, George Floyd is killed in North Carolina, and that unleashes a tornado of protests, injustice, because for millions and millions of people around the world, hundreds of thousands of communities, and dozens of countries themselves, for them, this isn't over. The racism that caused by the transatlantic slave trade, the legacy of it is still with us. And that's why it's important today that I've taken you around and we understand the buildings and their role in it, the stories they tell us, the people behind those buildings and the streets and the sculpture, and why it's important to remember the dark story of the transatlantic slave trade. And that's the end of a tour. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I really hope that you understand how important it was to actually walk the streets, see the buildings, and understand the stories that underpin the transatlantic slave trade. If you've got any questions, observations, please do email me and I'll do my best to answer them. And hopefully one day I'll see you again on the streets of London to hear some more stories. Thank you for watching.